Hey everybody, this is Billy with Wolf River Music. Well, here we are, episode number 1 of the Vinyl Review. So without any further ado, let's just get right into it. So the very first album on our list, which when it's all said and done, may include as many as 600 vinyl records, is coming from, arguably, the biggest band in the history of rock music. And that, of course, would be the Beatles. The album is Beatles for Sale, and it was released on the 4th of December, 1964. And like I said in the prologue episode, which I hope you got a chance to see first, our plan was to start right at the very tail end of 1964, which would put us literally right at the very beginning of what I'm going to refer to often as the golden age of rock music, extending from 1965 to 1971. Now, many other music critics might be inclined to extend that golden era into as far as about 1973, in order to include some of the other monumental releases in those other years, such as Exile on Main Street by the Rolling Stones, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars album by David Bowie, and also probably The Dark Side of the Moon, which of course was by Pink Floyd. But here we are now at the end of 1964, and the Beatles have already had one hell of a year. At this point in time, they are just physically and mentally exhausted, and they are just completely worn out. The Beatles basically toured the entire planet. They toured the United States twice, they filmed a movie, they did a countless number of television shows and radio interviews, and they are about to embark on the recording of their 4th album in only 21 months. Their record label is basically requiring them to record an album roughly once every 5 months. Now, since this is the very first episode, I'm going to take just a bit of time to let you know how we're going to handle these record reviews from here on out. And one of the most important things that I want you to be aware of is that we are always going to give and include some kind of a pertinent and a relevant historical perspective to these albums. In other words, where was the band or the artist at during that point in his or her or their careers? And what kind of an effect their state of mind or their current situations would have had on the music and on the release in question. Because in this case, with the Beatles, it would end up having a profound effect on this very album. I said that they were mentally and physically exhausted by the end of 1964. Why? Because first off, Beatlemania was at its full swing at this point in time, and it was causing mayhem and hysteria basically everywhere the band went. It was the screaming and the running and the mobbing of their vehicles that were trying to transport the band in and out of cities and into the venues where they were playing. And at these concerts, the band couldn't even hear their own voices or their own instruments on stage. You have to remember, the PA and amplification systems available to them during that time period were just not equipped to create enough decibel levels to compete with 50,000 hysterical screaming fans. And also, at some point, it had started to become common practice for people to throw objects at them from the audience, such as hard candy, stuffed animals, underwear, etc. And the Beatles hated playing these concerts because they just really were not that much fun. And staying inside their hotel rooms had become more of a cautionary exercise for their own safety and had begun to feel more like prison cells to them than like hotel rooms. Beatlemania, it could be argued, started right at about the time that the Beatles played on the Ed Sullivan Show for the first time on February 9th, 1964. 73 million Americans saw them play on that program. And based on the population of the United States at that time, that means that essentially 40% of the entire country was watching them live on that program, on the television sets, in their living rooms. There was no internet, no VCRs. There was no way to record it and to watch it later. You either saw it that night or you just didn't. Now, they spent the rest of that month of February of 1964 in the United States. They played concerts in Washington, D.C., in New York City, and in Miami, and then they returned to the UK in order to prepare for another gigantic whirlwind tour that included not only cities in the UK, but Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, and then back again to the United States in August. And during this same time period, they managed to record all the music for the soundtrack and the album for A Hard Day's Night. And they filmed all the scenes for that movie. Now, this frenetic pace that they were working at was just insane. And John Lennon was quoted at the time as saying this, quote, "Finding the time to create new and original songs for another Beatles album was becoming a hell of a problem," unquote. And I want you to remember that quote because, like I just alluded to a couple of minutes ago, the environment that albums are created in will always have the greatest impact on how they're going to turn out. And this one was no exception to that rule. The quality of some of the songs on this album, especially the ones that the Beatles chose to cover by other artists or were told to cover, did not necessarily help this album in the end. And the final rating that we gave this album is definitely going to reflect that factor. So I'm just giving you an advance warning. We're going to be fair, but we're also going to be brutally honest about all of this. And before we get into some of the finer details of the actual songs that are included on this release, there's a couple more points of historical significance that I really want to include here. So the first thing that happened was something in late August of '64, after the band had returned to the United States for their second U.S. tour. Now, the first recording sessions for some of the songs on the album Beatles for Sale actually began at EMI Studios in London on the 11th of August of that same year. But they only worked for just about a week on that album, and then they left again for the United States on August 18th of that same year. This U.S. tour was a month long. It was 30 shows in 23 different cities from coast to coast. Now, as this tour was about at its midpoint and on the East Coast, they met Bob Dylan for the first time in New York City. Now, I'm not sure just how much time they actually spent with Bob, but I do know this. This was the first time, allegedly, that the guys in the Beatles were introduced to the magical properties of marijuana. And they liked the results of this newfound source of creative inspiration that Dylan had just turned them onto. But also just as equally important to them were the conversations that they had with him in their hotel rooms in New York City. It was during this brief meeting that Dylan told the members of the Beatles that it was they who he felt were the most important musical figures in a cultural movement that he believed was just about to take place, not only in the USA and the UK, but basically throughout the rest of the entire Western world. And remember, this isn't just some random music industry person trying to pump up their egos or just schmooze with them, or a member of some other up-and-coming band trying to get in good with the Fab Four. This was Bob Dylan, and he had basically just more or less anointed them as the cultural torchbearers, and in his opinion, the most important musical group in the entire world at that time. So, was he right? Well, as far as they were concerned, he was Bob Dylan, and they were delighted by what he said to them, and they took it to heart. Now, on a side note, Bob Dylan is going to come up again in this vinyl review very shortly, and then he is going to return for a grand total of 14 different times. So we'll get to him in much greater detail later. But just suffice it to say that Bob Dylan is just about 6 short months away in September of 1964 from releasing his first absolute masterpiece of an album titled Bringing It All Back Home. Now, I can't even begin to stress at this time the cultural impact and the overall importance of this album that he released in March of 1965. And the biggest reason that I'm even mentioning it right here at all is that because also during this meeting between him and the rest of the Beatles, he had predicted correctly that the genres of traditional American folk music and rock and roll music were about to come together in a very big and a very significant way. And that whatever division may have existed between the fan bases of these two genres were about to evaporate, and a brand new style of music was about to be born. So I just can't really begin to stress enough how important this meeting was between Dylan and the Beatles, and just how much of an effect that it would have on the future of their music. And there's actually something also that's really kind of funny about all of this. You have to remember, in the late summer of '64, all of the Beatles are still relatively very young men, and they haven't yet spent a ton of time actually in the United States, and they haven't been exposed to all of the different and various forms of traditional American folk music versus the new folk revival or other genres that they were probably less familiar with, such as country and western music. Now, they had been hearing some of this music on AM radio as they traveled around in the American South, but John Lennon was strangely under the impression that Bob Dylan was actually considered to be a country and western artist. And he was also under the impression, probably for a very short time, that when he wrote the song, I'm a Loser, which he had attributed to being influenced by Bob Dylan, that he was actually writing a country and western song. Now, if you're only even somewhat familiar with that song, you will know that it is clearly not a country and western tune. You can hear the influence of Bob Dylan in that song, but it is not country music. Now, a couple of other songs on this album, especially the two that were written by Carl Perkins, you could definitely say have a very distinctive country and western twang to them. Or you could even describe some of the other music on this album as having a sort of a rockabilly swing to it. But in the end, as we wrap up the historical portion of this video and of this review, and then we get into the actual songs that are on the album, some of the ones that worked, and maybe some of the ones that didn't quite work as much. Let's just say that some critics have pointed to this one as quite possibly being the first commercially successful album that could be placed within the genre of folk rock. It's also very important to note that several other music critics have rightly pointed out that it was actually the Animals who had first successfully melded these two genres together into one with their bluesy rock version of the traditional American folk ballad, The House of the Rising Sun. Now, that band had recorded that song in London in a single take on the 18th of May, 1964, and it hit number one in the UK in July of 1964, which was 5 full months before the release of Beatles for Sale. And I can pretty much 100% guarantee you that all 4 of the Beatles were very aware of this record when it came out. Okay, now let's talk about the inner workings of this album, Beatles for Sale. All right, let's start off with the good things. First off, the Beatles, both as a group and as individual members, are beginning to grow and to mature, both as musicians and as songwriters, by the time this album came out. The lyrical content of their music is becoming more introspective than it had been on previous releases. They've gone from I Want to Hold Your Hand to No Reply and I'll Follow the Sun in roughly about the space of a single year. And they're showing signs of even better things to come. And they're also beginning to branch out in the studio. And even under some very strict time constraints, they're beginning to experiment with some different types of instrumentations, such as a timpani and African hand drums. They're beginning to use the studio as an instrument. They're experimenting with different types of reverbs, guitar feedback, multi-track overdubs, etc. It was also during this same time period that producer George Martin began to loosen the reins a little bit on the group and allowing them to have more freedom with their own creative impulses. For example, he allowed them to create a fade in to the song 8 Days a Week rather than just a simple fade out at the end of the song, which in those days was considered completely non-standard practice for any type of a pop song. But he allowed them to do it anyway. He allowed Paul McCartney to play some of the piano parts here, whereas in the past, it would have been him playing it, if there was even one being played at all. We're beginning to hear them making more uses of the idea of musical counterpoint or musical counter melodies within their songwriting. And no, I wouldn't necessarily say it's terribly sophisticated yet at this point. You can definitely hear them wanting to make more use of this idea or this musical technique within their songwriting and within their recordings. Most people who are familiar with the Beatles' history will often view the album Rubber Soul as being the most obvious and the biggest turning point in the Beatles' career. And it's always been that album that's always been thought of as the first great Beatles album. And there's a lot of truth in that. But I still think there's something to be said about Beatles for Sale. But of course, it's just a little more complicated than that. I think that this one had a lot of potential. And there was greatness within them that was beginning to show. But based on everything that we've already talked about that was going on during this whole year, it would only make sense that they would fall short of that greatness in several different ways. So let's talk about that part of it. So this album is a collection of 14 songs. 8 of them are originals credited to Lennon and McCartney, and 6 of them are cover songs by various artists such as Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Carl Perkins, and Dr. Feelgood and the Interns. So these were not songs that they had only just recently become familiar with. These were songs from their youth that they had been playing live for years, going back to their days at the Cavern Club in Liverpool and during their extended time staying in Hamburg, Germany. So they chose these songs because they could play them quickly and easily in the studio. And they were chosen to fulfill one purpose only, and that was to fill up roughly 14 and a half minutes of time on an album, basically just as B-side filler songs. And here's where we come to the Achilles heel, so to speak, of this album. Okay, so the song Mr. Moonlight, sung with great gusto by John Lennon. Unfortunately, often cited as one of those very few Beatles songs in history that probably just should have never been recorded at all. Paul McCartney plays a solo on a Hammond organ on this song that you would swear was actually recorded as a track for another song that somehow just made its way onto this one. And so I've heard this song described by another music critic as sounding like, quote, a ghastly quasi-calypso number dressed up in gaudy gold lame that must have been recorded as a joke, unquote. And that's rough, but yeah, not one of their finer moments on record. Not even close. John's passionate vocal is just not enough to save this one. And the same could probably be said for their cover version of the Buddy Holly classic Words of Love. And it's not so much that they butchered the song, they didn't. It's just that it really sounds more like they're trying to do their best impression of what they think a Buddy Holly song should sound like. And consequently, it just comes across as lacking originality and just a bit generic. And it sounds like it was a quickly recorded throwaway B-side song, which I guess we should expect under these circumstances. Honey Don't, which was written by Carl Perkins and then sung by Ringo Starr. This one seems to kind of come across as a hokey early attempt at a country rock song. Now, I guess in a way you do have to give them a little bit of credit for at least trying to do something that, at that point, not even they had ever attempted before. And then you have Rock and Roll Music, which of course is the very famous song written by Chuck Berry. Now, on this one, I actually would have to say that out of all the cover songs that they attempted on this album, this is probably the one that comes closest to at least a really decent, solid effort. It's not as good as their original material, but it's not awful. Okay, so here's the hard truth. There is not a single cover song on this album, Beatles for Sale, that serves in any way to make this a stronger album overall. In fact, really, quite honestly, the inclusion of these 6 songs on this album actually really kind of sunk it. And let me make one thing very clear. It's not their fault. It's really not. The Beatles had really outgrown this material by this point in their career. And that point is made clear when you compare the cover material to the strength of the original songs on this album, such as I'll Follow the Sun, I'm a Loser, and Every Little Thing, all being the high points of this album. And so these 3 songs being examples of their best work here. But for every strong cut on this album, it's equally brought down by other material that is just simply uninspired and mediocre at best. This album, basically, is just terribly uneven. And because their management and their record label wanted this album out and ready for the public by Christmas, those that were still calling the shots for this group seemed to be more interested in quantity than they were in quality. And, well, that's exactly what they got. And so, we gave this album, as it's presented here, a 7.6 out of 10. And by our grading scale, that's a C. It almost made a C+, but just not quite. But you know what? Take heart, Beatles fans, because it's still very early in the game, and they've got a long way to go. They've got a lot of room left for improvement and a lot of time left for growth as songwriters. And just FYI, just to give you a better perspective on how we came up with that rating, if you were to just simply take all the cover songs off this album and then replace them with 6 songs of equal or greater creative quality, we would have, by our calculations, actually given this album an 8.2, which is a much more solid B- than just simply a C. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it would have been considered one of their all-time classics, but it definitely would have been superior to the one that was actually released. And like I said earlier in the prologue episode, we don't just hand out A's and A+ just to be nice. And if we had given this album an A just because it was the Beatles, well then what on earth would we have been able to give to an album like Revolver or Abbey Road or Sgt. Pepper's, for that matter? And don't worry, because we're going to get to those albums soon enough. In fact, the album Help is coming up very quickly in our chronological countdown. And I have a sneaky feeling that it's going to receive a higher ranking than this one. I don't think it's going to be Rubber Soul necessarily, but I do think that at least it's going to be headed in that positive direction. And by the way, also, we still actually do recommend this album as part of a good, solid vinyl collection, if that's the kind of thing that you're interested in acquiring for yourself. You know, if you've only got enough money for 100 albums and vinyl is expensive, well then yeah, this would be a good addition to that collection. If you're a big Beatles fan, you've probably already got it. If you're not, well, it's a good place to start. I think that the main reason to recommend it is because of its cultural and its historical significance, and the fact that it represents a starting point, really, for, like we had said before, the genre of folk rock right here. And as far as we're concerned, this album is the perfect starting point to kick off what we like to think of as the golden age of rock, 1965 to 1971. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to ask you to do for us. First of all, please subscribe to our channel, and please keep watching every new episode in our series. We do greatly appreciate it. Now, you're definitely going to want to come back next time, because we've got another very well-known group that was the other big heavyweight from the mid-1960s. They were a young band, perhaps maybe you've even heard of them. They were known as the Rolling Stones. And you're going to find that much like the Beatles at that time, they were still really new at what they were doing. They were searching for their own identity and trying to figure out who they were. And so you don't want to miss that. And again, this is Billy with Wolf River Music. I want to wish you a good night.